Hello everyone. Today I would like to examine the life of a guy named Marcus Porcius Cato, who despite being a failure at the major pursuit of his life, has nonetheless impacted millions of people over the last 2,000 years. At least I would argue that. Some of the most notable of which were the founding fathers of the United States. His life is an interesting story, and I believe we can improve our own lives today by emulating some of his good characteristics and learning from the failures. This video is going to be the first of a two-part series exploring the life of Cato the Younger as we know him today. Specifically, we will be analyzing the cultural and historical backdrop of Cato, and then attempt to follow important events in his early life so we can kind of get a general sense of the positive aspects of his character and life, as well as his leadership style. While the second video is going to be more geared toward focusing on the negative aspects and the things that we can learn from his failures. Quick disclaimer: I am not a historian, and I am going to be cherry picking in this narrative. So this is not a biography, and I want to make it clear that this is an attempt to understand Cato and his character as a person, not kind of have a full-on story of what he did from birth to death. If you're interested in more of the chronological story of Cato the Younger, I would recommend the YouTube channel Cost of Glory. He did a really good series. So let's start kind of building a picture of the context that Cato lived in. He lived from 95 to 46 BC. And there was a lot of crazy changes happening in his lifetime that I think we all can kind of sympathize with. Rome's republic was, at least everybody agrees on this, in a death spiral at the point that he was alive. Some people can argue that it was just basically dead already before or after his death. That being said, everybody knows it was just kind of circling the toilet at the time. There was a lot of breakdowns of traditional thinking, the laws, and the economy as they knew it was in a crazy flux. Now we have to understand that Rome was based off of a traditional soldier farmer citizen model. What I mean by that is that in the old republic, specifically when inside the peninsula of Italy, the citizens of Rome were usually farmers. And if there was an outside threat of some sort, they would equip themselves with their own money, with armor and weapons or horses, whatever they need to be, and they would go out and campaign a while, and then once the battles were done, they would come back and farm again, right? Well, this model was very fundamental to their governing system. And even some of their governing structures, like how population blocks of people voted, was based off of this very model. The time that Cato came along, that model was collapsing almost completely. Rome had expanded beyond the peninsula into North Africa, Spain, and later in Cato's life into Gaul, or as we know, France today, thanks to Julius Caesar. And a lot of those citizen soldiers couldn't both be a farmer and a soldier at all times. And there was a lot of flux happening because they were needing a army that was a professional grade, right? You couldn't have guys that were part-time soldiers that could go to Africa and fight your wars for you. There was another aspect of it that I think is very important to understand, is that as Rome expanded, right, you had this huge influx of wealth from conquered territories and a huge influx of slaves that they would take in war. And that changed the economy of Rome substantially. And in many ways, like I would argue, it was just like any other society that's had slaves as its kind of backbone of its economy. It's kind of a poison pill. You know, once you're on it, it's kind of a drug. Once you're on it for a country, you're kind of stuck with it during the life of Cato and even after, where the wealthy elite would buy a lot of slaves and buy a lot of land from those more, you could say, middle class or lower class citizen farmers and create what we would know as a plantation. They called it the latifundia. Um, and they were able to basically push out a lot of these small scale farmers who, they now keep in mind everybody had slaves back then if you had any money, but the fact that these were so big and in many ways they were able to be very profitable because of that fact that they didn't have to hire anybody. They just had to maintain their slaves and keep their crops up, and they were able to provide a cheaper product. A lot of Roman citizens, because of this phenomenon, were still citizens, but they were very poor. And there was a big rift between those who had a lot of money, lots of slaves, and those who had nothing. And this is just the Roman citizenry, which is a tiny portion of the actual population of the empire as we know it. There was this big rift between what during Cato's time, the Optimates, who were more like the citizen traditionalists, and they were, again, if you're a citizen, if you're a Senate member of some sort, you were the top crust of society most likely, or coming from the second tier, but you were top tier generally. And then you had the Optimates and the Populares, who were populist reformers that wanted to kind of help balance out the scales of power at that time. There's another aspect that you should know about is the widespread corruption at the time. Elections were, if you think they're crazy today, they were nuts. It wasn't so much focused on individual one person, one vote. You would usually come together as a block of people to vote for whatever law was being presented or whoever was being elected, right? And there was people that their full-time job was to basically be a go-between between the person that was trying to become elected. They would give them the money, and then they would be a middleman between them and the voting citizens, right? And it was a way that, if you're kind of a down on your luck citizen, you could get money, and the guy could get power, and the guy in the middle was getting a whole bunch of cash as well. So it was like just rampant. And then there was also a lot of violence associated with this culture, specifically around elections, because if you could somehow make it so people were fearing for their safety or their lives by going to vote, whatever block that might have been, you could basically intimidate them from not voting. And if they didn't vote, well, then your candidate won. There was a lot of different ways that this went through, right? There was also another aspect that's very important for, I think, all of us to understand, is that there was two really dominant figures that were overshadowing the landscape around Cato's birth. One was called a guy named called Marius. The other one was called Sulla. Marius was a very successful general down in North Africa. And he was realizing, as I mentioned before, that the citizen farmer soldier model was not working anymore. You needed a professional army if you're going to be going overseas. And he was also noticing that a lot of his soldiers he was not able to get a lot of soldiers into his ranks because you needed to be a Roman citizen that probably had land, right? There was a whole lot of things that were, barring recruitment at the time. So he changed the fundamental structure of the army. One, he made it so that non-citizens could join. Two, he made it so that the soldiers were dependent on the general for their pay, not the Senate or the government. And then three, the retirement benefits of those soldiers were dependent also on that general. And in that day and age, it usually meant that you were given a plot of land if you were able to survive as a veteran in Rome. Now, we're kind of getting into a time frame, right, where Cato was just a very young person, like a very small person. Around 88 BC, one of what used to be Marius's lieutenants, a guy named Sulla, became a pretty prominent general in his own right. And he became the first Roman general to lead a Roman army against Rome itself, which was a huge breach of precedent. There's no way that you can get the toothpaste out of the tube at that point. It changed the precedent of generals all the way to that point. And you have to understand, this is close to 500 years of history of this republic standing and not having to deal with this. So it was a big breach. And around 82 to 81 BC, since he had conquered the city by force, he elected himself dictator. Now you have to understand, back in the Roman times, the word dictator wasn't the exact meaning that we give it today. It was actually a legal Roman office that basically gave an individual emergency powers to basically be a king for about a 6-month period. And they had the power to basically circumnavigate any laws that were normally given to people in power, and it allowed the Roman government up back on its feet and stabilized before they could go back to business as usual. Well, he decided that he is the dictator for life, and he started creating what he called the prescriptions, state-sponsored hit list, to eliminate enemies and anybody he basically didn't like. And then abruptly, he just retired, right? So let's move on to the life of Cato himself. As I mentioned before, he was born in 95 BC. And unfortunately, he was orphaned very early and was raised by his uncle by the name of Drusus. Around 91 BC, when he was about 4 years old, Drusus was killed, assassinated, for supporting basically Italian citizenship for a lot of the communities in the Italian peninsula. I want to just kind of put a quick pause on that. Like, whatever Cato did after this point as a person, he's going to have this branded on his memory. Now, basically, the father that he knew was killed for political reasons. And for Cato to move on to do the things that he did in life, as you will soon see, this had to always be hovering over his head. Now, to move forward into his teenage years, remember that guy named Sulla, who I mentioned earlier, that sacked Rome the first time? Well, he was actually taking a shine to Cato and his brother due to a close relationship with his father before his father died, Cato's father. And I want to quote specifically from this guy named Plutarch, who is our main source for Cato's life. Now, Sulla was friendly to Cato and his brother on their father's account, and sometimes actually asked them to see him and conversed with them. So Sir Pedon, who is the teacher of Cato, thinking that this conduced greatly to the honor and safety of his charge, was continually bringing Cato to wait upon Sulla at his house, which at that time looked exactly like an inferno, owing to the multitude of those who were brought thither and put to torture. Now Cato, in his 14th year, when he saw the heads of the reputed to be imminent carried forth, and heard them smothered groans of the bystanders, he asked the tutor, "Why do you know why no one slew this man?" "Because, my child," said the tutor, "men fear him more than they hate him." "Why then," said Cato, "didst thou not give me a sword that I might slay him and set my country free from slavery?" When Sir heard this speech, and saw the look in the boy's face, which was full of rage and fury, he was so frightened that in the future he kept him under close watch and ward, lest he should venture upon some rash deed. So let's just say Cato could call a spade even at a young age. He knew when something was wrong, and even if the person that was doing it wanted to be kind to him, he had no qualms in calling something evil that was evil. Now let's skip a little further along. He into his 20s, where Plutarch tells us that he studied under this guy named Antipater the Tyrian, a Stoic philosopher. Quote, "He made a close companion of Antipater the Tyrian, a Stoic philosopher, and devoted himself especially to ethical and political doctrines. He was possessed, as it were, with a kind of inspiration for the pursuit of every virtue, but above all, the form of goodness which consists of rigid justice that will not bend to clemency or favor was his great delight." So I think this is a little bit of foreshadowing of probably the negative aspects of Cato's character, but it also reinforces what I had just brought to you earlier with Sulla. He was extremely cognizant of right and wrong, and to live his life in a way that at least understood the differences and when you divert to one or the other. Now, to delve a little deeper into kind of Cato's against the grain way of kind of living, I'm going to quote Plutarch again. "In general, Cato thought he ought to take a course directly opposed to the life and practices of the time, feeling that those were bad and in need of great change. For instance, when he saw that a purple which was excessively red and vivid was much in vogue, he himself would wear out the dark shade. Again, he would often go out into the streets after breakfast without shoes or tunic, aka he was going barefoot in commando in Roman form. He was not hunting for notoriety by this strange practice, but accustoming himself to be ashamed only of what was really shameful, and to ignore men's low opinion of other things." I think that's very telling. Um, and when we kind of get to the wrap up of this video, I want you to remember that part. He was not hunting for notoriety, but by this strange practice, but accustoming himself to be ashamed only of what was actually or really shameful, and to ignore men's low opinion of other things. He was also elected a military tribune, and served in Macedonia. And it is reported to us that he marched on foot as an officer, while other men of his rank were riding. And the quote is that he willingly shared the tasks which he imposed upon others, and in his dress and way of living and conduct on the march made himself more like a soldier than a commander. In this way, without knowing it, he produced in his men this at the same time the feeling of goodwill towards himself. So, in other words, he wasn't just all show, right? He was willing to live out what he preached, which I think is very important. Now let's move on to his political career, starting in around 65 BC. He was elected to this position of quaestor. Now, I'm going to do a quick introduction to what that means. Quaestors were kind of a entry level position for wannabe senators, and you needed to spend about a year in that office for you to become a member of the Roman Senate. And it's very important to understand that there was a lot of different jobs associated with this position. Some quaestors were sent off to the Roman provinces as basically assistants to the governors there. And one notable example would have been Julius Caesar, who was basically running the Spanish province while the actual governor was running around with an army trying to put down rebellions. There was also another set of quaestors who were elected to Rome itself, who were in charge of basically the treasury, the public funds of the time, kind of the IRS of the Roman Empire at the time. And we were told by Plutarch that he worked really hard at understanding the job and understanding it well, to the point that he was actually schooling the people that were working there full time on how to do their jobs. If they were doing something wrong or fraudulent, he was catching them and prosecuting them. And if they didn't really know their job, they were just making honest mistakes, he was just teaching them. So he was like laser focused on that. And it got to the point where, as he was prosecuting people for fraud, one of these clerks specifically was under the favor of a guy named Catulus, who was a pretty prominent politician, and his role was the censor of the Roman world. Now, you have to understand, we do have censors today, right? We have the census, right? This is where we get the same word. The censor back then had a very similar job in that they were categorizing who, if you were a voting citizen of Rome, what strata of the society you came from, so that they could appropriately put you in a block to vote. That was very important and very confusing and messy, but also they were kind of like the morality police a little bit back in the day. Like, if you were put into a position of censor, if you saw something that another Roman was doing, even a high level one, that was shameful or against the social mores of that time, you could call them out and have them prosecuted. So high level guy, senior politician, if you will. And as they're in the process of Cato bringing this clerk to court, basically, Catulus is trying to intervene for this guy, and he kept pushing the envelope, even over after he could find that clerk, he couldn't really save him in the court of law. He was just kind of pushing Cato, just like, hey man, like, this is just how it is. Like, this is how we run things in this town. Like, who are you and what are you to question it? And I'm going to go and quote Plutarch here. It would be a shameful thing, Catulus. This is quote Cato speaking. If thou, who art the censor and shouldest scrutinize our lives, were put out of court by our bailiffs. When Cato had uttered these words, Catulus fixed his eyes upon him as if he would make reply. He said nothing, however, but either from anger or from shame, went off in silence, much perplexed. What he's basically saying is that if you don't be quiet, if you don't keep pushing this, I don't mind sending you to jail if I have to. And it's going to be extra embarrassing since you're the guy that should be following and monitoring our moral actions. And this guy just kind of going like, wants to say something and just kind of puts his hands up and walks away. Just didn't even know what to do. It's funny because he kind of became this proverb for honesty back in his day. It was kind of the Cato standard, if you will. And I think it's best explained by this quote from Plutarch. In consequence of this, he was held in high repute, so that an orator at a trial, where the testimony of a single witness was introduced, told the jurors that it was not right to give heed to a single witness, not even if he were Cato. And many already, when speaking of matters which were strange and incredible, would say, as though using a proverb, this is not to be believed, even though Cato says it. So it's kind of interesting to kind of peek into this kind of meme that he created for himself, I guess, where if you have a court proceeding where there's only one witness, well, then they would basically sit there and go, well, even if this guy was Cato, we still couldn't move forward because we need more than one, right? Or, that's so outlandish that even if Cato said it, it's probably wrong. It's kind of good to have that kind of, to be known for that kind of honesty, I think. So the question that I kept asking myself while I was researching this video was Cato's way of doing things actually effective? And I think I can honestly say that they were at certain points. And Plutarch makes an interesting point. Now, quote, by thus humbling the clerks and making them submissive, and by managing the businesses as he himself desired, in a little while he brought the quaestorship into greater respect than the Senate, so that all men said that and thought that Cato had invested the quaestorship with the dignity of the consulship. So that's a pretty high praise, because the consulship was the equivalent to the highest, for sure, peacetime position you could have in Roman government at the time. It was their equivalent of the president of the United States. He goes on to kind of mention how he made sure that those who owed the treasury, the government, money, he went after them and made sure they paid up. But he also was very meticulous about, if anybody had lent any money to the government, they were paid back. Now, Plutarch makes an interesting point that previous office holders of the quaestorship had kind of run a little bit off of hearsay when it came to new laws that had passed in the Senate or in the public assemblies. And they found that a lot of them would just kind of get a secondhand account that something had passed and there was a new law that needed to implement it. And they're like, okay, let's just move forward with it. Cato put a stop to that. When he heard of a new bill, he actually had the actual consuls, the people sitting in the Senate assembly, coming in and swearing an oath to the fact that this was a new law that needed to be implemented. It wasn't just hearsay and trying to make favors because people went, trust me, bro, right? The last thing that I want to mention that Plutarch kind of highlights is that during his time as quaestor, he pretty much went on a rampage looking up the people that had worked with the old general / dictator Sulla that we mentioned before. And he got their names and found those people, specifically the ones that had profited by working with Sulla. And he did his best to get those funds back to where they needed to go. And he also was in charge of prosecuting them as best he could. And a lot of them ended up being executed after going through trial. And no one had made this point. That, I mean, everybody knew who these people were. They didn't like them. They were too scared to do anything about it. And Cato was like, all right, I'll do it. And made the call. And Plutarch makes this interesting point. Quote, "At this all men were delighted, and thought that with their deaths the tyranny of that former time was extinguished, and that Sulla himself was punished before men's eyes." So it was a way of bringing catharsis to a really nasty time in their history, and bringing, I would say, healing. You can kind of see he's just, because of his staunch advocacy for truth, justice, and accountability, he's kind of changing the atmosphere, right? He's changing the atmosphere that he's working in, and pretty effective, at least in this point. So, to fast forward a lot of time, and as I said, I'm cherry picking here different parts of his life to specifically kind of look at Cato through this kind of more positive lens. This episode is specifically around the last literally days of Cato's life, and probably the lowest of his life at the time, because he ended up committing suicide right after this. But he was in charge of this town called Utica in northern Africa, and he was basically in a position of support for the armies of the Republic, which was fighting Caesar at the time. And Cato's allies had lost, and Rome as they knew it was gone. The Republic had lost almost completely, at least according to the military standpoint. And Cato's in this weird position where he's in charge of this town full of people who were originally loyal to Caesar. And him and his group of people, a bunch of senators from Rome, or outcasts from Rome, right, are there. There's the natives that had originally been Caesar's friends. And then there was a bunch of cavalry soldiers that were just escaped from the battle with Caesar and were, you could say, very disgruntled and rowdy and ready to kind of just kill and burn and steal. And he basically utilized his reputation for honesty and integrity to maintain peace between all of those factions and to preserve life all the way to the very end, where those that wanted to leave and go across the sea or travel across Africa could do so, and do it in a way where no one was getting robbed and no one was getting slaughtered. And he kind of single-handedly did that. And I think it just kind of stands to kind of his character and his another proof in the pudding of who he was as a person. So as we wrap up this video, I want to leave you with 3 principles that I was personally able to glean from the life of Cato and what I want to apply to my own life. The first one is to make truth and accountability one of the top disciplines in my life. And what I mean by that is truth and accountability primarily for myself, and then for those immediately around me. In other words, or to put it another way, is to be so consistent with that discipline that I can call myself out when I am listening or acting out on something dishonest. And we've all run into this, right? You start believing something about yourself or about the society in general or about someone close to you that the facts don't align with, but we still persist in believing certain things. We all struggle with it in some form or another. And if I'm able to maintain that discipline, that it makes it so that my very presence forces both myself and others to check our own consciences and to possibly make a positive change. It's not always the case, but in the stories that I told you of Cato, whether it was in Utica or in Rome while he was a quaestor, that a willingness to follow the truth and maintain accountability, I think changed at least those pockets of his influence for the better. Principle number 2: refuse to live your life out of fear of people. It is better to be infamous for looking and acting strange comparative to the current culture you're living in, while trying to live out the truth to your best of your ability, than to run around trying to please everybody out of a sense of a desire for popularity, even safety, or just acceptance, right? And then the third principle is a little bit more nebulous, but I think there's something to be said about how Cato was willing to go to the source material if he was going to act out on a perceived truth. It was the example I brought from Plutarch, where if he wouldn't take any word of mouth of whether or not something had passed in the sin or not, he wanted to actually hear it from the people involved and get their okay from it. And I think that's something we need to do in our own culture. And it's harder to do, I think, in our culture than even in his day, right? There's just so much information. We don't have enough time in the day to consume the information that is made every day. But if we're going to act on what we think is a truth or a fact or whatever you want to call it, we need to try and do our due diligence within reason, again. But that is the main 3 that I was able to glean from his life. And I'll be 100% honest. When I first started researching Cato, I honestly just wanted to go straight to the negative part, because I still believe he was probably one of the main contributors to the downfall of Rome with the position he was in, at least the Roman Republic. But there is some, as with everybody and every person, he's not a 2D character. As I was finishing up this video, this scripture came to mind from John 3:19 through 21. And again, for my audience who is not Christian, this is not to make a sermon, right? I'm not trying to do that. And I'm not trying to even imply that Cato was a Christian, but I believe he was a seeker of truth in his own way. And the principle is probably the biggest thing that we need to latch on. And I believe this scripture really hits it right where it needs to be. So this is the quote. "This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light." And they're speaking of Jesus here. "Because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God." And this is something that we all are going to wrestle with in one form or another, whether you're a Christian or not. I think we've all experienced different cultures, whether it's in a family system or a work environment or what have you, right? Where you know when truth is a high priority, right? And you usually want to be part of, in most cases, if it's done with balance. And this is where I would like to explore the other side, kind of the darker side of Cato's character in this second video. But in balance, the culture you want to be a part of is the one where truth is at a premium and people are accountable to it, even if you don't want it specifically for yourself, at least to be accountable to it. And the dilemma that Cato lived with pretty much his whole life is something that we all struggle with in one form or another if you interact with people at all. That we have basically two choices when we're dealing with some sort of crooked culture of some sort. We can leave or we can reform. And there are very good people in all of history that have done both of those. But if you decide to stay, I think some of the principles that Cato lived out can help us in that. And also have to make sure that we are willing and understanding that if we do stay, we have to count the cost. He lost his life because of the stance he took. Granted, it was because he committed suicide, and I think that was also a negative aspect of his character. But he made an impact that has rippled through many years. If we were to make our communities, our families, our institutions healthy, having those principles in mind will put us in a way better place than whatever else we may think we can do by navigating and compromising and trying to just go with the flow. So in conclusion, Cato spent his entire life trying to use Stoic ethics to stop the decline of the Roman Republic. He believed that if he stayed personally incorruptible, he could inspire the Republic to some sort of health. Instead, his rigidity often forced his enemies into tighter alliances and unintentionally brought an acceleration to the demise of the Republic as he knew it. In my next video, I will explore the negative side of his character and how we can avoid some of the great mistakes that he did. By the way, my name is Stephen, and I am exploring how to navigate modern life with all of its intensity and upheavals using lessons from history, logic, faith, and personal experience. If you think this journey will enrich your own life, I would encourage you to like, subscribe, and comment. I want to hear from you what other positive aspects of Cato you think could be added to our lives today. Anyway, thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.